Don't know how long I was filming with lipstick on my teeth, so we're gonna try this again. Hello there. I figured it was time that I should probably chat with you about some of the books that I have read so far this year. Thankfully, so far I have enjoyed most of the books that I have read in 2024. If this is your first time to my channel, hi, my name is Lillian. I love talking in depth about books and writing and the creative process. And if you enjoy this video and would like to see more, you are more than welcome to subscribe. I would love to have you here. But with that, let's get to the meat of the video, shall we? The first book I'm going to mention is this memoir by Dr. Drew Gilpin Faust called Necessary Trouble Growing Up at Midcentury. I listened to this initially as an audiobook at the beginning of the year and enjoyed it so much that I wanted to pick up a physical copy for an eventual reread. The audiobook is narrated by Dr. Faust herself, who also happens to be a historian that I admire, and I actually happen to have one of her books on my nonfiction shelf, and I'm now more inspired than ever to pick it up pretty soon here. Anyways, this is a fantastic memoir of Dr. Faust's life. She was born in 1947 and came of age during the social and political turmoil of the 1970s. Her life itself is really fascinating. She was born and raised in a very socially prestigious family in Virginia that was definitely very much part of the lineage of the Old South, the white aristocracy, a family that was very much in favor of maintaining the status quo of racial segregation in the community. And this is something that Dr. Faust starts to realize from a somewhat early age, and something that as she gets older and more into education and academics starts to unpick and unravel for herself. Faust also recounts parts of her own family history, how her grandparents and her parents both had their life paths severely altered and shaped by war. Faust in many ways was sort of the unspoken black sheep of the family and was very much oftentimes at odds with her mother, who at one point in her own life had been a very headstrong, independent young woman, but had bought into the norm and the societal expectation of the 1950s housewife. Faust's mother couldn't seem to understand why her daughter would be so interested in academics and wanting to excel in them and seeing that as a good thing, as well as wanting to make a life on her own terms instead of defaulting to the life of a housewife. I love how in this memoir Dr. Faust is contextualizing aspects of her own family lineage as well as aspects of her own life in the social and political zeitgeist of the time. Leave it to a historian to write a well-balanced, socially conscious, contextual memoir that's both intimate as well as widely examining. Faust does touch on a number of highlights on what was going on politically at the time, the counterculture movements that she was a part of, the student organization efforts that she participated in, anti-Vietnam War protests, civil rights protests, etc. I really hope that I get to reread this book this year and annotate it. That's how much I loved it. I would highly recommend picking this up if it sounds interesting to you. Next up, I'm going to talk about some manga that I read recently, but if that is not your thing, I will put a timestamp up on the screen over here that you can fast forward to if you would like to skip ahead. But if you are interested in hearing me talk about some manga that I read recently, first and second omnibus of the Noragami series, and I'm not gonna force myself to hold these both up at the same time while I talk, so I'm gonna put them down now. Each of the omnibuses covers 3 volumes of the manga, so within those 2 books I have read the first 6 volumes of the manga. I had picked these up because I had wanted to dive into the manga that an anime that I had watched several years ago was based off of. Most animes don't cover the full scope of a manga series unless they're ultra popular, like for example One Piece. I had heard that this manga series was going to be wrapping up soon, and I was curious to read the actual ending of the story and get to see how things wrap up, not just how they did in the anime. This manga is an urban fantasy set in modern day Japan. We're following a minor god named Yato, who's down on his luck and struggling to gain followers. Yato has big dreams of becoming a well-known and revered deity, but for now he's stuck doing odd jobs to try and raise funds to buy himself a shrine. Hiyori is another main character in this series, and she gets mixed up in Yato's world when a near-death experience causes her soul to become loose from her body, causing her to have random occurring out-of-body experiences, or more like trances perhaps, where she is navigating the spirit world where Yato resides. Because of this, she enlists Yato to help her get her soul firmly back in her body, and ends up getting sucked into Yato's various schemes and meets a cast of other deities and characters from Shinto mythology along the way. I watched and really enjoyed the anime adaptation of some of the initial volumes of this manga series that came out maybe around 10 years ago or so. So my memory on the finer points is a little bit fuzzy. I will say that the first omnibus was a little bit slow on the uptake and took me a bit to get into. It was slower paced than I remember the opening scenes of the anime being, which I do remember very much a sense of being sort of action-packed and really drawing you in. That being said, I felt like the second omnibus is where things definitely started to pick up and become more engaging. There was a plot arc that started in the first omnibus and concludes in the second one involving the god of war that I don't remember playing out to the full extent in the anime as it does in the manga, so that was really cool to see, and you get some really interesting snippets of Yato's backstory. I don't remember this being part of the anime, but there were definitely some eye-roll moments when it came to objectification of a certain female deity, as well as the routine insult against her being something akin to skank or whore. On the one hand, I was slightly surprised because this series is written by two women, but at the same time not entirely surprised because Japan in general is a more socially conservative country where feminism isn't a widespread social norm or widely viewed as a positive thing. I do plan on continuing to read this series. I have the next two omnibuses lined up on my shelf, and I'll keep you posted on how it goes. The other manga series that I've started is Yokohama Kaidashi Kikou by Hitoshi Ashinano. Apologies for any mispronunciation of any of that. I'm so glad that I picked this up after spotting it in a bookstore when I was on my no-buy last year. I took a photo of it so that I would remember to pick it up when I could, and ended up really enjoying it. This is a beautiful slice of life manga where we're following an android named Alpha who runs a cafe in a rural seaside community. It's set in a future Japan long after an environmental catastrophe has occurred. In this first omnibus bind-up of the first 3 manga volumes, I believe, we meet Alpha and see her start to engage with some of the other characters that live in her community or who come to visit her in her cafe. This is a wonderfully cozy series of vignettes, of interactions, Alpha's adventures, and the connections she makes with people and some fellow androids. The world building in this story alludes to changes that have happened as a result of the past ecological disaster, but life has still managed to go on in this quiet, ruminating, and peaceful way, despite some of the huge shifts that are sort of touched on. The book description tells us that the story takes place in the, quote, twilight of humanity, and that Alpha and her fellow residents enjoy the, quote, melancholic beauty of life even as the end approaches. Which you might think makes for a very depressing story, but actually I found quite the opposite. I think the way that Ashinano depicts it, it's done in a very comforting, palatable sort of manner. I feel like it was a calming reminder of mortality in general, that peace can be found in the inevitable while celebrating the beauty of life, the world around us, and the connections that we make with others. The art in this volume is also stunning. The compositions of the landscapes I found to be particularly beautiful. There are stretches where there is little to no dialogue. However, Ashinano does a great job of carrying the story through his characters' facial emotions, them being in motion, and or the context of the physical space around them. I loved this first omnibus and will definitely be picking up more in the series. Next we have this gorgeous little book that I'll try not to harp on for too long because I talked about it in a whole reading vlog that I will link up above and down below if you're interested in hearing me talk more about this, but this is Journal of a Solitude by May Sarton. I adored this book. It's a journal that the writer and poet May Sarton kept for a year when she was mainly sequestered away in a house in Connecticut, focusing on her writing. It was a really great insight into the life and the mind of an established writer, still in the process of making and contending with the anomalies of living a life centered around creativity. Her struggles with her craft, her own self-doubt, mental health, and the balance between the obligations of her day-to-day life and the exterior world and the interior world and the life of the mind. I won't harp on this book book too much more if you're interested in hearing my thoughts. Again, vlog will be linked above in the cards and down below. Safe to say, I also adored this book. I found it personally very comforting and poignant as a writer myself. A moment for the gorgeous cover of this book that I'm going to talk about next. This is Julia Hungry by Louise Poston. This was a poetry collection that I was incredibly excited for and pre-ordered when it was first announced. Full disclosure, Louise Poston is one of my favorite YouTubers, and while the majority of her content isn't directly poetry or writing related, when she announced that she had a poetry collection coming out, it just made so much else click into place. Her sense of presence, articulation, and command of language embodies a poet. I'll link the 2 videos that she's made talking about this collection and poetry in general. If you'd like some more in-depth info on this, I would recommend checking her out in general. She's, again, one of my favorites. She was working on this collection for about 10 years before she was able to get it published, dealing with the incredibly difficult market that is poetry publishing, and I'm just so grateful that this collection got to be put out into the world because, oh man, is it exquisite. And I'm not just saying that because I really enjoy Louise Poston's YouTube videos. Hannah definitely talks about this more in one of the videos that she made in the lead up to the release of this, how she's been a lifelong student of poetry, has her master's degree in poetry, having learned the craft and its forms at the knee of its famous, well-regarded white male poets, and having reverence for their work, but at the same time not always being able to fit herself and her own experience inside of it. Julia Hungry is a communion and a reckoning with form, a female poet's apprenticeship to the male-dominated canon of 20th century verse, part love affair and part fencing match with its forebears. Inherited forms are intact almost to a fault, but flooded with femininity. As if an attempt to rinse them out in kind, the poems are laced with uneasy domesticity, a current of tension which begins inside the home and expands over the course of the book, eventually reaching a global scale. There, fully haunted by the music of the past, Julia Hungry peers into the future, asking questions about reclamation and survival. Fencing match is such a perfect word to describe this poetry collection. It's so witty, playful, reverent of a long-standing craft, while at the same time there is this sense of a push and a pull with older masters and poking holes here and there in the traditional facade. There are several poems in this collection that are, shall we say, playful inversions of well-known poems from the 20th century poetic canon. The first poem in this collection is a play on Rainer Maria Rilke's archaic Torso of Apollo, which I will put up on the screen here, and you can pause to read it if you would like. And once you've read that, or if you're familiar with the poem already, I'll read you Louise Poston's version. Archaic Torso of Apollo after Rainer Maria Rilke. The sculpture is headless. Even so, he has a gaze. He looks out at you from his loosened marble chest. If he had eyes, they would glow like 2 ripe fruits. If he had breasts, they would fracture the bold beam of his sight, scatter its fragments across the walls of the museum, dappling the other pieces of art with light. Look at his crotch. It's smiling, a mouth full of seeds. The whole thing flickers, scanning you like a laser, like a beast about to charge. Even this dead, decapitated man can make you feel his scrutiny. Your life is completely out of your control. Safe to say, I got a pretty good chuckle out of that first poem, and it definitely set the tone for the rest of this collection, which, if you can't tell, I adored. I finished reading this last week, but have been repeatedly picking it up here and there, flipping to a random page and just revisiting the poems inside of it. 1, because they're delightful, and 2, because there's just so much here. Julia Hungry is a veritable feast, and if you love poetry, I would highly recommend checking this out. Let's talk about My Antonia by Willa Cather. This was my first Willa Cather experience, and I think I can say I like it. Definitely had mixed feelings about it. Let's get into it. I've wanted to read Willa Cather for many years now, mainly because her work has a lot of thematic ties with some of my own family history of Swedish immigrants in Nebraska running farms and living in sod houses at the turn of the 20th century. My Antonia is narrated by a man named Jim Burden, affectionately reminiscing on his childhood in a farming community in rural Nebraska and his childhood friend Antonia. It's a portrait of individuals, a community, and a time period period in history in a specific place. As a child, Jim Burton had left Virginia at the age of about 10 years old to live with his grandparents in Nebraska after both his parents had passed away. In Nebraska, he grew up in a farming community where most of the people who were farmers were immigrants, and the majority of folks who lived and owned property in town were families that had been in the area for several generations already. This takes place when there had been a recent influx in Scandinavian and Bohemian, aka Czech Republic, immigrants to the area wanting to establish farms for themselves. There was an interesting aspect of class analysis in this book that I wasn't really expecting. The children of these immigrant families in many ways are othered by the children of families that have been living in the area for many generations. First on the basis of coming from a different country, not speaking English, but also on the basis of them, due to need and poverty, having to work alongside their parents out in the fields instead of going to school, or coming from a family that already had a strong financial basis. They were also viewed as not necessarily being trustworthy based on the fact that they were immigrants. There were parts of this book that I enjoyed and parts where I could definitely appreciate Cather's writing. For me, in the end though, I wasn't necessarily as engrossed as I had hoped to be based on hearing other people's experiences of reading Willa Cather. I wasn't as captivated as I had anticipated to be with the setting. Nebraska is a place that I've visited and is rife in my own family history and lore, and I think the reason for this is mainly the point that I'm about to get into. I found that I couldn't fully get swept up in the romantic reminiscing of the narrator Jim Burton for this time and this kind of life, knowing the context of colonization and the intentional genocide of indigenous communities and ecosystems that made it possible for the expansion of white settlers in this part of the world. I think there may have been one, maybe two very vague references to indigenous peoples in this book, but they weren't talked about as some sort of present thing, but rather a mystic anomaly from a very distant past. For the most part, the language and the imagery that is describing the setting of this story, I found leaned into the colonial manifest destiny idea that the plains were an empty wilderness prior to being settled, and that the people who settled them tamed them into civilization, a viewpoint that just didn't sit well with me. The context of colonization is something that I try to keep in mind even when I'm thinking and talking about my own family history. While my ancestors were very likely fleeing poverty in their home country, facing hardship once they did get to Nebraska, and working to build a better life for themselves and their children, that was still made possible by years of violent conflict, genocide, and white supremacy sanctioned by the US government so that they could sell land allotments to white farmers, who then in turn turned the native ecosystem into farmland. There was definitely an undertone of whitewashing and romanticizing that I had somewhat anticipated from this book, but in the end definitely ended up flavoring my overall experience with it. And I found that it was something that I just couldn't quite get past and fully sink into the story itself. Next is a poetry collection that I've been reading since last summer and have finally finished. This is Persistent Voices, Poetry by Writers Lost to AIDS. This is a collection edited by Philip Clark and David Groff. This, as the title suggests, is a collection of poetry from writers who passed away during the AIDS epidemic. A number of poems in here do grapple with the epidemic, diagnosis, which at the time was pretty much a death sentence, the loss of friends, partners, living with a terminal condition. Though at the same time, there is definitely a good percentage of this collection that is focused on other aspects of these people's lives that aren't centered around things like grief and loss. This collection was both emotionally heavy, but also joyous, nostalgic, and pensive. I didn't necessarily love every poem or poet that was featured in here, but I definitely found a number of real standouts for me and poets whose work I definitely want to investigate further. If this collection sounds interesting to you, or you're interested in getting a taste of a bunch of different poets and styles, I would recommend picking this up. The next book that I'll talk about is Grief is a Thing with Feathers by Max Porter. I I listened to this on audiobook from the library, which I think certain parts definitely lent themselves to, for example, the character Crow's poetic rambles. I think there was definitely something gained in listening to the audiobook, but at the same time, but also something that I can't quite put my finger on, felt like it was missing without having the text in front of me to see visually and read. This is a rather experimental book by Max Porter, where we're following a father and his two young boys who have recently very suddenly lost their mother. I think I would definitely like to pick up a physical copy of this book for reread at some point. There were a number of parts that felt very fragmentary, and I wonder if seeing that visually on the page, if they were arranged in some sort of way, that would potentially add something to the experience of reading it. The father is a Ted Hughes scholar, and so Max Porter has characterized this family's grief as Ted Hughes's character, if you want to call it that, Crow. I enjoyed Crow as a character as well as a metaphor for grief in all of its messy parts. I do think I had hyped this book up in my head for so long that I imagined it as something more encompassing of grief than it actually was. Yes, it's about grief, specifically the grief of losing a family member, a wife and mother, and I think I was expecting it to wax poetic about grief as a whole, which I don't think would have served the purpose of the actual narrative of this book. I had just built up that expectation in my head. There were certainly lines in this story and could probably be taken as speaking about grief at large. Maybe I was hoping that I would find a rumination on grief that more so reflected my own experience with it, which in the end isn't really fair to the book, which overall I thought was quite good and I enjoyed, and I should probably go make the art that I need to see my grief in and feel healed by. So those were some books that I have read recently and I wanted to discuss with you, share my thoughts on. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of these books and what your thoughts were on them, or if you're interested in picking any of them up. If you like this video, feel free to give it a thumbs up. It definitely helps my channel grow, but I think that about wraps up my recent reads. I hope you have been enjoying what you've been reading recently. Feel free to tell me about it in the comments below as well. However, that is all from me, folks. I hope you enjoyed, and I really look forward to seeing you in my next video. Bye.